Washington and Beijing are both vying to be the top economic player in Africa. China is pouring billions of dollars in infrastructure projects and foreign aid in an attempt to woo the continent's growing economies, while some say the United States is lagging behind in that effort. On this week's Plugged In with Greta Van Susteren, USAID's Mark Green lays out the United States' approach to leveling the playing field with China.
Tariff policy is now kicking in. And so I believe that it will create a conducive atmosphere for us to grow that trade even more. We're looking on the Ghanaian side for Chinese industries to come and help us add value to the products that we have so that we can export back into the Chinese market.
China is removing all tariffs from all African countries. This is huge, and definitely it is going to ruffle some feathers, especially Western nations, because it is a big move that will encourage African countries to trade with China, even though China has been the #1 trading partner for African countries for over 15 years.
In 2025, Wang visited Namibia, the Republic of Congo, Chad, and Nigeria. In mineral-rich Namibia, he emphasized the nation's mutually beneficial economic ties.
那么我们之间首先是政治上是相互信任的，同时我们经济是高度互补的。最重要的是，中国有坚定的加强中非友好的政策和信念。
Well, China also says it's ready to work with South Africa to enhance people-to-people exchange and cooperation. Chinese Vice Premier Liu Yandong says this will boost the mutual understanding and friendship between the two countries. She made the remarks ahead of the first China-South Africa people-to-people exchange in Pretoria. South Africa's Arts and Culture Minister Natim Tetwa says the two countries will be cooperating in science and technology, education, culture and...
The policy briefing on China's economic and trade cooperation with Africa brought together top diplomats, policymakers and trade officials. Speaking at the event, the head of mission of the People's Republic of China to the African Union, Ambassador Hu Changchun, emphasized the long-standing relationship and growing trade between China and Africa. He noted that trade volume between the two sides reached over $219 billion last year.
China has been Africa's top trading partner for 15 consecutive years. Last year, our trade volume reached over $219.5 billion, up 6%. Imports from Africa to China grew around 7%.
Something historic is unfolding quietly across global trade routes, shipping lanes, and commodity markets, and most people are missing it. Not because it isn't massive, but because it isn't loud. There were no dramatic announcements, no televised confrontations, no formal declarations of rivalry. Yet the consequences of what's happening right now may reshape global power for decades. For the first time in generations, the world's most resource-hungry economy is no longer looking west when planning its future. It is looking south, and the shift is not symbolic. It is structural, strategic, deliberate. This isn't about a single deal or one commodity. It's about a complete recalculation of where power, security, and survival truly lie. From the metals that power electric vehicles to the oil that fuels global logistics, the foundation of industrial dominance is being rebuilt, and the materials holding it together are increasingly coming from one place: Africa. What makes this moment so disruptive isn't just that Africa is supplying more resources. It's that Africa is now being treated as irreplaceable, as essential, as central to long-term planning in a way that challenges assumptions held for nearly a century. Assumptions about who controls supply chains, about who gets priority access, about who shapes the future of global growth. For decades, resource strategy followed a familiar pattern: stable suppliers, predictable partners, established routes. But that model is breaking down under pressure from rising demand, political uncertainty, and a world moving faster than old systems can handle. In that environment, dependency becomes risk, and risk demands alternatives. Those alternatives are no longer theoretical. Across copper belts, oil basins, lithium corridors, and strategic ports, investment patterns are changing. Infrastructure is expanding. Long-term contracts are locking in access not just for today, but for decades ahead. This is not a pivot made out of ideology or emotion. It is a cold calculation about reliability, scale, and future growth. copper, once treated as just another industrial input, has become the backbone of electrification. Oil, long considered mature and predictable, has re-emerged as a geopolitical weapon in an unstable world. Controlling access to both means controlling the pace of development itself, and in that equation, Africa offers something few others can: abundance paired with expansion. What's often overlooked is timing. This shift didn't happen overnight. It accelerated when global systems showed cracks, when sanctions disrupted flows, when supply chains proved fragile, when political pressure turned trade into a liability instead of a guarantee. In those moments, the search for stability led away from tradition and toward opportunity. Africa offered both. Unlike older suppliers constrained by mature infrastructure and political gridlock, African producers represent growth curves that are still rising: new fields, untapped reserves, expanding capacity, and perhaps most importantly, flexibility, the ability to negotiate long-term frameworks without being locked into outdated assumptions. About hierarchy and dependency, this changes everything. Because when long-term strategies change, power follows, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Decisions made today about where to source energy and minerals determine who holds leverage tomorrow, and leverage shapes diplomacy, trade, and influence far beyond the resources themselves. This is why the shift matters far more than headlines suggest. It signals a move away from reliance on any single traditional supplier, a recognition that past dominance does not guarantee future relevance, a realization that the center of gravity in global resources is drifting, and once it moves, it rarely comes back. For Africa, this moment represents more than opportunity. It represents validation. A transformation from being seen primarily as a supplier of raw materials into being recognized as a strategic partner in shaping the next phase of global development. That distinction changes how negotiations happen. It changes who sets terms. It changes who has options, and options are power. For those watching closely, the signs are everywhere: shipping routes realigning, refining capacity expanding closer to source, investment flowing into ports, railways, and processing hubs designed not just to export resources, but to anchor long-term relationships. These are not short-term plays, they are foundations. What makes this especially disruptive is that it challenges a deeply ingrained narrative that global strategy must always revolve around the same players, the same regions, the same assumptions. That narrative is losing credibility as reality evolves. The world is becoming more competitive, more fragmented, and more resource-intensive. All at once. In that environment, strategy favors diversity over dependency, it favors growth over stagnation, and it favors partners who can scale with demand rather than constrain it. Africa fits that future. This is not a story about replacement driven by hostility. It is a story about replacement driven by necessity, by mathematics, by logistics, by long-term survival in a world where energy transitions, industrial expansion, and geopolitical uncertainty collide. The most important shifts in history often happen quietly, long before the consequences are fully understood. By the time the headlines catch up, the structure has already changed, the choices have already been made, the momentum is already locked in. This is one of those moments. From copper to oil, the building blocks of global power are being resourced, reprioritized, and resecured. And in that process, Africa is no longer on the sidelines of strategy. It is at the center of it. What happens next will redefine alliances, reshape trade, and rewrite the map of global influence, not through confrontation, but through calculation. And by the time the world fully realizes what has happened, the shift will already be complete. The deeper consequences of this shift only become visible once the surface narrative fades. What looks like a simple redirection of trade is, in reality, a systemic transformation, one that alters how leverage is created, how influence is exercised, and how the future is negotiated. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for those who assumed the old order would adapt without consequence, because strategy is not about today's supply, it is about tomorrow's vulnerability. For decades, resource planning relied on a narrow set of assumptions. Stable suppliers would remain stable, political alignment would outlast economic cycles, and access would always be negotiable through pressure or incentives. Those assumptions are now being dismantled by a world that is more fragmented, more competitive, and far less predictable. Demand has exploded faster than infrastructure could keep up. Electrification has turned copper into a strategic weapon. Energy insecurity has turned oil back into a geopolitical shield. Rare materials are no longer inputs. They are leverage points, and in this environment, concentration becomes risk. That realization triggered a quiet but relentless recalibration. What mattered most was not sentiment or ideology, but control over long-term flows. the ability to secure resources without interruption, to diversify exposure, to avoid choke points that could be weaponized by politics, sanctions, or instability elsewhere, and when that calculus was applied honestly, the answer became unavoidable. Africa offered scale without saturation, while traditional suppliers struggled with declining output, regulatory bottlenecks, and internal polarization. African producers represented expansion rather than maintenance. New projects were not about squeezing the last drop from aging systems, but about building capacity from the ground up. That difference matters more than most realize, because building new capacity allows strategy to shape infrastructure from the beginning. Ports, pipelines, refineries, railways, processing hubs, all designed around future demand, not past habits. This creates integration rather than dependency, and integration is far more resilient under pressure. Another factor quietly reshaping priorities is geography. Supply routes that once crossed politically sensitive corridors are increasingly viewed as liabilities. Long chains with multiple points of exposure are harder to protect, harder to ensure, and harder to stabilize in crisis. Shorter, more controllable routes reduce risk, and Africa's proximity to multiple markets makes it uniquely positioned in this regard. But geography alone is not enough. What truly shifted the balance was alignment of incentives. Many African producers are not merely exporting resources. They are seeking industrialization, processing, and value capture. This aligns perfectly with partners seeking stability and long-term engagement rather than transactional access. It turns resource deals into development frameworks, locking both sides into shared outcomes. This mutual dependency is strategic gold. It means relationships are less likely to fracture under political stress, less likely to be reversed overnight, less vulnerable to external pressure, and once embedded, these frameworks become self-reinforcing, pulling investment, technology, and labor into a shared ecosystem. This is how influence quietly migrates. While headlines focus on confrontations and rhetoric, real power shifts through contracts, infrastructure, and logistics. By the time political discourse catches up, the economic architecture has already been laid, and dismantling architecture is far harder than canceling agreements. The implications ripple outward as more resources are secured through diversified channels. Bargaining power elsewhere diminishes. Leverage once assumed permanent becomes conditional. Pressure loses effectiveness when alternatives exist. And when pressure fails repeatedly, its credibility erodes everywhere, not just in one region. This is why the shift matters far beyond commodities. It alters negotiation dynamics across trade, finance, technology, and diplomacy. Countries that were once expected to align automatically now calculate openly. They compare offers, they hedge risks, they assert preferences, and that behavior spreads quickly once it proves viable. For Africa, this moment accelerates an internal transformation as well. Resource strategy becomes national strategy. Decisions are no longer reactive but proactive. Governments begin thinking in decades rather than cycles, leveraging global competition to extract better terms, deeper investment, and greater autonomy. This does not mean dependence disappears. It means dependence is managed, and managed dependence is power. What unsettles established powers most is not the loss of access, but the loss of predictability. Systems built on assumption struggle when choice enters the equation. Influence becomes harder to project when outcomes are no longer guaranteed. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. When dominance feels inevitable, strategy becomes lazy. When dominance is questioned, strategy becomes reactive. That transition creates missteps, overcorrections, and missed opportunities, and in a fast-moving global economy, hesitation is costly. Meanwhile, the resource landscape continues to tighten. Competition intensifies. New technologies increase demand for materials faster than supply can scale. Energy transitions add pressure rather than relieving it. In this environment, securing diversified access becomes not just smart but essential. Africa's role in this future is no longer optional. It sits at the intersection of energy security, industrial growth, and geopolitical flexibility. That position attracts attention, investment, and influence whether anyone is ready for it or not. And once embedded in global strategy, it cannot be sidelined without consequence. This also reshapes internal African dynamics. Countries with resources gain leverage over those without. Regional cooperation becomes more valuable. Infrastructure connectivity takes on strategic urgency. The continent's internal integration accelerates as external demand increases. Power consolidates not just between regions but within them. And this consolidation further reduces external leverage. The more Africa coordinates, the harder it becomes to isolate or pressure individual actors. Collective capacity changes the game entirely. What emerges from this process is not a sudden reversal of global hierarchy, but a steady redistribution of influence, a world where power is more dispersed, alliances are more flexible, and strategy is driven by necessity rather than tradition. This is the world now taking shape. The shift from copper to oil is symbolic not because of the materials themselves, but because of what they represent: control over the present and leverage over the future. Whoever secures both gains the ability to shape outcomes far beyond the resource sector, and that control is no longer concentrated where it once was, the most important takeaway from this transformation is not who loses ground, but why. Systems that rely on assumption eventually collapse under complexity. Systems that adapt survive. The global order is entering a phase where adaptability matters more than legacy. Africa's rise within this framework is not accidental. It is structural. It is rooted in demographics, resources, geography, and timing. And once those forces align, they are extraordinarily difficult to reverse. This is not a temporary shift driven by crisis. It is a long-term realignment driven by strategy. And as this realignment deepens, it becomes clear that the question is no longer whether Africa has replaced anyone in global calculations, but whether the world has fully grasped the consequences of that replacement. Because when strategy changes at the foundation, everything built on top of it must eventually change too. And the next phase of global competition will be shaped not by who speaks the loudest, but by who secured the future first.